In the spring of 1901, when the Pennsylvania hills still echoed with the clanging of mill hammers and the desperate dreams of dying towns, a peculiar advertisement appeared in the Gritsboro Valley Ledger. The Winslow Zoological Garden promised wonder and spectacle to the soot-covered families of the region, a chance to witness exotic beasts from distant continents without leaving the shadow of the smokestacks. What the advertisement failed to mention was that some visitors to this remote attraction would never leave at all. The zoo sat in a natural depression locals called Sorrow Gulch, where the morning fog lingered long past noon and voices seemed to die before they could escape the tree line. On a gray October morning in 1902, a traveling salesman named Harold Wickham paid his 25 cents and walked through those ornate iron gates. His companions watched him disappear around the bend toward the big cat enclosures, heard what they assumed was a lion's roar echoing up from the gorge, and thought nothing more of it when Harold failed to rejoin their group. When they asked about their missing friend, Elias Winslow smiled that peculiar smile of his and assured them Harold must have grown tired and left early. But Harold Wickham's horse and wagon remained hitched outside the gates, and his sample cases of Bibles and patent medicines were found scattered near the tiger pen, as if dropped in haste. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. What no one realized was that Harold Wickham had not left the Winslow Zoo at all. He had simply become part of the exhibit, fed to creatures that were learning to prefer the taste of human flesh over any meat that money could buy. To understand how such horrors could unfold unnoticed, you must first understand Gritsboro itself. This was not a place that invited questions or welcomed strangers who lingered too long. The town clung to the sides of a narrow valley like a scab on wounded earth, its brick buildings stained black with coal dust that fell like snow 12 months of the year. The Allegheny Ironworks dominated the valley floor, its smokestacks breathing poison into air already thick with desperation. The people of Gritsboro worked 16-hour shifts for wages that barely bought bread, and when the whistle finally released them from the mills, they stumbled home through streets that reeked of sulfur and industrial waste. These were not citizens who had energy left for curiosity about their neighbors, especially neighbors who lived beyond the town limits, in places decent folk rarely ventured. The Winslow Zoological Garden occupied the deepest part of Sorrow Gulch, a natural depression that began where Crimson Creek wound its way down from the mountains. The creek earned its name honestly, running rust-red with iron ore and chemical, runoff from the mills upstream. Local children were forbidden to play near its banks, not just because of the pollution, but because sound behaved strangely in the gulch. Voices carried poorly up the steep sides, swallowed by the perpetual fog that rose from the water and caught in the branches of ancient oaks. A scream from the bottom of the gulch might reach the rim as nothing more than a whisper, if it reached at all. The Winslows had chosen their location with the precision of architects designing a tomb. The zoo itself sprawled across 15 acres of broken terrain, connected by winding gravel paths that seemed to double back on themselves without warning. Visitors often complained of losing their way, of paths that led nowhere, of dead ends that forced them to retrace their steps past enclosures they could have sworn they had already seen. The main attraction was Predator's Gorge, a natural amphitheater where the big cats paced behind bars that were always slightly too close for comfort. But it was the areas marked employees only that truly defined the character of the place. These sections, shrouded in canvas tarps and overgrown with thorny vines, contained what the Winslows euphemistically called their processing facilities. Here, behind barriers that kept out curious eyes, the real business of the zoo was conducted with the methodical efficiency of any other industrial operation. This was not a place of wonder designed to educate and inspire. This was a labyrinth designed to lose things in, a carefully constructed maze where the only exit was through the belly of a beast. Elias and Prudence Winslow arrived in Gritsboro in the winter of 1900, carrying little more than a collection of trained animals and a wagon full of carnival equipment that had seen better decades. They introduced themselves as former performers with Barnum's traveling show, though no records would ever confirm this claim. What mattered to the desperate town fathers was not their credentials, but their promise to bring culture and spectacle to a valley that had known precious little of either. The couple had operated under the stage names The Great Marvolo and His Mystical Menagerie, a modest carnival act that featured trained birds, a handful of exotic cats, and Prudence's unsettling ability to charm serpents with nothing more than a whispered song. Those who had seen their performances in the traveling circuit described an act that was less entertainment than ritual, with the animals displaying an almost supernatural obedience to their human masters. Elias stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown bear, which he had been known to do during their carnival days. His hands bore the permanent scars of a lifetime spent handling creatures that could remove fingers without thought, yet he moved among the most dangerous animals with the casual confidence of a man tending house cats. When he spoke of their dream to create a permanent home for their performers, his voice carried the fervor of a preacher describing paradise. Prudence was smaller in stature but no less commanding in presence. She possessed the pale, almost translucent skin of someone who spent her days indoors, yet her arms and hands were crisscrossed with thin white lines, evidence of countless encounters with claws and beaks. Her smile, which she deployed frequently during their early months in Gritsboro, never quite reached her gray eyes, creating an expression that local children found deeply unsettling. The Winslows made their home in a cramped apartment above what had once been the zoo's reptile house, surrounded by the detritus of their carnival past. Faded posters advertising death-defying feats with nature's most deadly predators covered the walls, while cages of various sizes filled every available corner. The smell that emanated from their living quarters was a nauseating mixture of incense, ammonia, and something organic that visitors could never quite identify. Their relationship with the animals went far beyond the professional bond between trainer and performer. They spoke to the creatures in whispered conversations that could last for hours, conversations that seemed to involve actual responses from beasts that should have been incapable of such communication. Townspeople who observed these exchanges from a distance reported feeling as though they were witnessing something fundamentally wrong, something that violated the natural order between human and beast. When questioned about their methods, Elias would explain that animals were simply misunderstood by most people, that they possessed intelligence and loyalty that surpassed anything found in the human world. Prudence would nod in agreement, adding that their animals were not mere performers, but family members deserving of love, protection, and proper nourishment. What neither of them mentioned was how far they were willing to go to provide that nourishment, or what they considered to be the most appropriate diet for creatures they loved more than their own species. They loved their animals with a ferocity that would soon curdle into something monstrous, something that would transform their dream of a permanent sanctuary into a nightmare that fed on human flesh. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong with the Winslow Zoo came in the autumn of 1901, barely 6 months after the grand opening. A traveling Bible salesman named Jeremiah Polk had arrived in Gritsboro on the morning train, his sample cases heavy with leather-bound gospels and patent medicines that promised salvation for both soul and body. He was last seen arguing with Elias Winslow at the zoo's entrance, his voice carrying across the gulch as he demanded to know why admission cost 25 cents, when the handbill clearly advertised 15. Witnesses later recalled hearing Elias laugh, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the damp air of Sorrow Gulch. One moment Polk was gesticulating wildly with his walking stick. The next he was following Elias down the winding path toward the predator enclosures, his complaints fading into the perpetual fog that clung to the valley floor. When the evening train arrived and Polk failed to board, the conductor made inquiries at the local boarding house. The proprietress confirmed that the salesman had paid for his room but never returned to collect his belongings. His sample cases were discovered the following morning, scattered near the tiger pen as if dropped in sudden haste. The Bibles were water-stained and the patent medicine bottles lay shattered against the cage bars, their contents seeping into the rust-colored earth. Constable Jedediah Crow dutifully recorded the incident in his ledger, noting that Polk had likely grown frustrated with poor sales and departed on foot for the next town. This explanation satisfied most of Gritsboro's citizens, who had little patience for outsiders who came to their valley hawking false promises of better days. But 3 weeks later, the butcher's dog was found mauled at the zoo's fence line, its throat torn open with a precision that spoke of intelligence rather than animal rage. The wounds were unlike anything Doc Henley had seen in 40 years of treating both man and beast in the valley. They were too clean for a bear attack, too deliberate for the work of wild cats, and far too severe to have been inflicted by any of the domestic animals that roamed Gritsboro's streets. More disturbing still were the reports from neighbors who lived closest to Sorrow Gulch. They spoke of hearing the sound of water against concrete late at night, a rhythmic splashing that continued for hours after the zoo had officially closed. Old Man Hemlock, whose shack sat upstream from the zoo, claimed he had seen Prudence Winslow hosing down what appeared to be a loading dock behind the big cat enclosures, working by lamplight in the hours before dawn. When approached about these nocturnal activities, Prudence explained that she was simply maintaining proper hygiene standards for the animal facilities. She smiled that peculiar smile of hers and suggested that perhaps the townspeople should concern themselves less with her cleaning habits and more with supporting their local attraction. The town fathers, desperate to maintain the fragile tourism that the zoo provided, chose to accept this explanation. They dismissed Old Man Hemlock as a drunk whose testimony could not be trusted, and they buried the incident report about the butcher's dog in a filing cabinet where it would gather dust for the next 2 years. The signs were there, written in a language no one was yet willing to read, painted in blood that everyone chose to mistake for rust. By the winter of 1902, the Winslows had refined their method of acquiring what they euphemistically called supplemental protein for their growing collection of carnivores. The technique was as simple as it was effective, relying on the desperate nature of men who had nowhere else to turn and no one who would miss them when they vanished. Handwritten notices began appearing on bulletin boards at train stations throughout the region, tacked to the walls of flophouses and boarding rooms, where transient workers gathered to warm themselves around coal stoves. The advertisements were modest in their promises, written in Prudence's careful script on cheap brown paper that would dissolve in the first heavy rain. "Work for lodging," they read. "Strong hands needed at Zoological Garden. Inquire at Sorrow Gulch, Gritsboro Valley." The Winslows displayed a keen understanding of human desperation, targeting men who carried their possessions in flour sacks, who paid for meals with coins counted twice before spending. These were the seasonal laborers who followed railroad construction crews, the miners whose lungs had given out before their bodies, the immigrants who spoke little English and trusted even less in the promises of strangers. Most importantly, these were men who had severed ties with family and community, men whose absence would be attributed to the natural wandering of rootless souls. When such a man presented himself at the zoo gates, He would find the Winslows to be the most gracious of hosts. Elias would greet the visitor with genuine warmth, commenting on the hardships of winter travel and the difficulty of finding honest work in such troubled times. Prudence would appear with hot coffee and thick slices of bread, her pale hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared a meal that many of these men had not enjoyed in weeks. The conversation would inevitably turn to the visitor's circumstances, his skills and experience, his hopes for steady employment. The Winslows listened with the attention of concerned neighbors, nodding sympathetically at tales of closed minds and broken promises. They understood, they explained, what it meant to be cast aside by a world that valued profit over human dignity. The job they offered seemed almost too generous to be real. Simple maintenance work around the animal enclosures, feeding schedules that required no special knowledge, and living quarters provided free of charge in exchange for labor. The hours were flexible, the work was honest, and the company of exotic animals provided entertainment that no amount of money could purchase in the outside world. But first, Elias would suggest, perhaps their new employee would like a proper tour of the facilities. This was a privilege not extended to ordinary visitors, a chance to see the zoo as it truly operated after the paying customers had departed. They would walk the winding paths by lamplight, past enclosures where great cats paced with unusual energy, their eyes reflecting the flame with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The tour always ended at the processing facilities, the areas marked employees only, where the real work of the zoo was conducted. Here, Elias would explain, they prepared the special diet that kept their animals in such magnificent condition. The work required discretion, he would add, with that peculiar smile, because the general public did not understand the scientific principles involved in proper animal nutrition. For these lost souls, men who had spent months searching for a place that would value their labor, the zoo was not a fresh start, but a final destination, a place where their usefulness would be measured not in hours worked, but in pounds of flesh. What transformed the Winslow Zoo from a simple carnival attraction into something far more sinister was the methodical precision with which Elias and Prudence conducted their operations. This was not the work of mad killers driven by uncontrollable urges, but rather the careful execution of a business plan that had been refined through months of trial and error. The processing facility occupied the upper floor of what had once served as the zoo's hayloft, a wooden structure that overlooked the predator enclosures from a height that allowed for convenient disposal of waste materials. The Winslows had converted this space into what appeared to be a standard meat preparation room, complete with drainage systems, hanging hooks, and industrial cutting tools that would not have seemed out of place in any commercial butcher shop. The victims were rendered unconscious using the same veterinary sedatives that the Winslows employed to manage their most dangerous animals during medical procedures. These powerful compounds, originally developed for use on Siberian tigers and African lions, proved devastatingly effective when administered to unsuspecting humans. A single injection, delivered under the pretense of a routine vaccination against tetanus or typhoid, would render a grown man helpless within minutes. What followed was conducted with the dispassionate efficiency of any other industrial process. The bodies were processed using techniques that Elias had learned during his years working in Chicago slaughterhouses before joining the carnival circuit. Nothing was wasted that could serve a useful purpose, and everything that could not be fed to the animals was disposed of through carefully planned channels. The non-organic evidence presented the greatest challenge to their operation. Personal belongings, clothing, and anything else that might identify a victim had to be destroyed without creating suspicious smoke or drawing attention from neighbors. The Winslows solved this problem by constructing a specialized incinerator behind the bear enclosures, disguised as a standard waste disposal system for animal bedding and kitchen scraps. Items that could not be burned were weighted with stones and dropped into the deepest pools of Crimson Creek during the darkest hours of night. The creek's rust-colored water and swift current carried these materials downstream, past the millworks and into the larger river system, where they would never be recovered by curious investigators. The feeding schedule was perhaps the most crucial element of their entire operation. Rather than delivering large quantities of human flesh to a single enclosure, which might have aroused suspicion among visitors who noticed unusual behavior in particular animals, the Winslows distributed their product across multiple species on a carefully planned rotation. The big cats received portions on Mondays and Thursdays, mixed with enough conventional horse meat to mask any unusual characteristics. The bears were fed on Tuesdays and Fridays, while the wolves received their supplements on Wednesdays and Saturdays. This system ensured that no single group of animals displayed the heightened aggression and unusual vitality that came with their new diet. But what happened next would shatter their carefully constructed system. If you want to discover how this nightmare finally unraveled, hit that subscribe button, because the evidence that destroyed them came from the most unexpected source. Most importantly, the rotation prevented any single animal from developing what prudence called exclusive preferences for human flesh. The Winslows understood that their operation could only continue as long as their animals remained capable of consuming conventional meat when human sources were temporarily unavailable. The financial records that would later be discovered by investigators revealed the true genius of their scheme. While legitimate zoos spent enormous sums on meat purchases to feed their carnivorous animals, the Winslow operation showed a precipitous drop in wholesale meat orders beginning in the winter of 1902. Yet the animals appeared healthier and more vigorous than ever, displaying the kind of robust condition that visiting animal experts attributed to superior husbandry practices. It was a business model refined over months of operation, where the livestock paid for the privilege of being slaughtered, where the product marketed itself by walking through the front gates, and where disposal of waste materials was accomplished by the very creatures that had consumed the evidence. The first crack in the Winslows' carefully constructed facade came not from the authorities or suspicious townspeople, but from a victim who should have died with all the others. Samuel Hartley was 17 years old when he stepped off the train in Gritsboro in November of 1903, carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a note from the county orphanage explaining that he was mute but capable of physical labor. Samuel had been born without the ability to speak, a condition that had made him unwanted by potential adoptive families and ultimately led to his aging out of the orphan system with nowhere to go. The work for lodging notice he carried had been torn from a bulletin board at the Pittsburgh train station, and he had spent his last coins on a ticket to what he hoped would be a new beginning. The Winslows received him with their usual warmth, and Prudence seemed particularly taken with the young man's obvious intelligence despite his inability to communicate verbally. She provided him with paper and charcoal so that he could write out his responses to their questions, and she clucked sympathetically when he described his circumstances in careful, childlike script. What the Winslows failed to realize was that Samuel's muteness had sharpened his other senses to an extraordinary degree. He noticed details that speaking people missed, observed patterns that others dismissed, and developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it manifested. When Elias suggested the customary tour of the facilities, Samuel felt something in the older man's demeanor that made his skin crawl with warning. The tour proceeded normally until they reached the processing facility, where Elias made his standard speech about the special diet that kept the animals in such magnificent condition. But as they climbed the narrow stairs to the converted hayloft, Samuel caught a scent that had nothing to do with animal feed. It was the metallic smell of blood, old and dried, mixed with something sweet that made his stomach turn. When Elias moved to administer what he claimed was a preventive injection against disease, Samuel's survival instincts finally overcame his desperate need for shelter and employment. The boy twisted away from the approaching needle and bolted for the stairs, his canvas bag forgotten in his haste to escape whatever horror awaited him in that reeking chamber. Elias pursued him with surprising speed for such a large man, but Samuel's youth and terror gave him advantages that his pursuer could not match. He crashed through the zoo grounds in the gathering darkness, past enclosures where great cats roared with unusual excitement, as if they sensed the proximity of fresh meat that was escaping their reach. Samuel found temporary refuge in the aviary, a large enclosed structure that housed the zoo's collection of exotic birds. The peacocks and parrots seemed less threatening than the predators, and the thick vegetation provided cover where a small person might hide until daylight offered the possibility of escape. But the Winslows were systematic in their search, and they knew their property far better than any frightened boy could hope to navigate in darkness. Samuel heard them calling his name with false concern, promising that they only wanted to help him, explaining that he had misunderstood their intentions. Their voices grew closer as the night wore on, and Samuel realized that his only chance of survival was to remain hidden until someone else discovered his presence. He spent 3 days and nights in the aviary, surviving on water that dripped from the roof and scraps of fruit that the birds had discarded. During those desperate hours, he witnessed things that would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his life, things that he recorded in frantic drawings on scraps of paper torn from feeding schedules. When Old Man Hemlock finally found him on the 4th day, Samuel was near death from exposure and dehydration, but clutched in his frozen fingers were the drawings that would finally expose the true nature of the Winslow Zoo. The drawings told a story the town could no longer ignore, sketched in charcoal lines that trembled with terror, but spoke with unmistakable clarity about the horrors he had witnessed. Constable Jedediah Crow had spent most of his adult life trying to maintain order in a town that seemed determined to destroy itself through willful ignorance and industrial poisoning. He was not a man given to flights of imagination or supernatural explanations for earthly problems. But when Old Man Hemlock burst into his office, carrying a half-dead boy and a collection of drawings that depicted scenes from a nightmare, even Crow's practical nature could not dismiss what lay before him. Samuel's drawings were crude but unmistakably clear in their meaning. Stick figures with wide, terrified faces were shown being dragged toward a large building by 2 larger figures with grotesquely smiling mouths. Other sketches showed people being pushed into what appeared to be a deep pit, while still others depicted great cats feeding on shapes that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to human forms. The most disturbing drawing showed the interior of a building with hanging shapes that could only be interpreted as butchered carcasses, presided over by the same smiling figures that appeared throughout Samuel's testimony. At the bottom of this particular sketch, the boy had written in shaking letters, "They cut them up like pigs." Crow spent the better part of a day questioning Samuel through written communication, gradually piecing together a story that seemed too monstrous to be believed. Yet the boy's terror was genuine, and his detailed knowledge of the zoo's layout could only have come from someone who had actually been there. Most convincing of all were the specific details about the processing facility that Samuel could not possibly have invented. Armed with this evidence and his own growing suspicions about the unusual number of transients who had vanished in the vicinity of Sorrow Gulch, Crow finally did what he should have done months earlier. He traveled to the county seat and obtained a warrant to search the Winslow Zoological Garden for evidence of criminal activity. The search took place on a bitter December morning when the fog hung so thick in the gulch that the investigators could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Crowe brought with him 2 deputies, the county coroner, Dr. Isadora Finch, and a court stenographer to record whatever they might discover. What they found in the first hour of searching was enough to confirm Samuel's testimony beyond any reasonable doubt. Personal effects were scattered throughout the animal waste disposal area behind the predator enclosures, items that had been buried beneath months of accumulated filth but preserved by the winter cold. A child's leather shoe, a pocket watch engraved with the initials J.P. that perfectly matched the description of Jeremiah Polk's timepiece, a woman's locket containing a photograph of 2 small children, and dozens of other items that spoke of lives cut short. But it was the discovery in the processing facility that transformed suspicion into certainty. The converted hayloft still reeked of death despite the Winslows' efforts to clean the space, and the wooden floors bore stains that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. Hanging from the ceiling were the hooks and pulleys that had been used to suspend the bodies during butchering, while the drainage system showed clear evidence of having channeled large quantities of blood. When confronted with this evidence, Liam O'Malley, the zoo's only other employee, broke down completely and confessed to his role in the disposal operations. Through tears and violent shaking, he described how the Winslows had threatened to feed him to the animals if he refused to help with their gruesome work. He had helped dig the disposal pits, had assisted in moving the bodies, and had kept his mouth shut out of pure terror. O'Malley's testimony provided the final pieces of the puzzle that Crowe needed to understand the full scope of the Winslows' operation. But when the investigators rushed to arrest the couple, they discovered that the cottage above the reptile house stood empty, its contents hastily packed and removed. They had the evidence, but the masterminds were already slipping through their fingers like smoke through the bars of an empty cage. What transformed the Winslow case from a collection of horrific testimony into an ironclad legal case was the methodical work of Dr. Isadora Finch, the county coroner who had accompanied Constable Crowe on that fog-shrouded December morning. Dr. Finch possessed the kind of scientific mind that the citizens of Gritsboro found deeply unsettling in a woman, but her expertise in forensic medicine would prove invaluable in documenting the true scope of the Winslows' crimes. The break in the case came when one of the zoo's Siberian tigers, a magnificent beast named Titus, died suddenly of what appeared to be a digestive ailment. The Winslows had been gone for 3 days when the animal succumbed, and O'Malley, terrified of being blamed for its death, immediately contacted the authorities rather than attempting to dispose of the carcass himself. Dr. Finch saw an opportunity that might never present itself again. She ordered the tiger's body transported to her makeshift laboratory in the basement of the county courthouse, where she could conduct a thorough autopsy away from the prying eyes of townspeople who might object to such unseemly work being performed by a woman. What she discovered when she opened the animal's stomach cavity would haunt her for the remainder of her career. Mixed among the partially digested horsemeat and bone fragments were items that had no business being inside any animal that had been fed a conventional diet. A brass button bearing the insignia of the Union Army, a fragment of human finger bone that showed clear knife marks, and a swatch of woolen cloth that matched no uniform or equipment used at the zoo. But the most damning evidence was a small silver locket, tarnished but intact, that had somehow survived the tiger's digestive processes. When opened, the locket revealed a photograph of 2 young children and an inscription that read, "To my beloved wife, Christmas 1898. The locket perfectly matched the description that had been circulated in missing persons reports from 3 counties away. Dr. Finch documented her findings with the precision of a scientist and the attention to detail of a prosecutor building a case. Her official report, submitted to the county prosecutor, included detailed sketches of each piece of evidence, chemical analysis of the bone fragments, and a comprehensive assessment of the tiger's stomach contents that left no room for alternative explanations. Meanwhile, Constable Crowe had obtained the zoo's financial records from the local bank, where Elias Winslow had maintained accounts for both personal and business expenses. The ledgers told a story that corroborated everything the physical evidence suggested. Beginning in the winter of 1902, the zoo's wholesale meat purchases had dropped precipitously, falling from nearly $200 per month to less than $50. Yet during this same period, visitors to the zoo consistently reported that the animals appeared healthier and more vigorous than ever before. The big cats displayed unusual energy and aggression. The bears had developed glossy coats that shone even in the perpetual gloom of the gulch, and the wolves had grown noticeably larger and more muscular than their wild counterparts. The mathematical impossibility was undeniable. The Winslows claimed to be feeding a collection of large carnivores that should have required hundreds of pounds of meat per week, yet their purchasing record showed they were buying barely enough conventional protein to sustain a handful of house cats. The animals themselves were thriving on a diet that the official records claimed did not exist. When Dr. Finch's forensic evidence was combined with the financial records and O'Malley's terrified confession, the case became airtight. The animals themselves were the most damning witnesses, their very vitality serving as testimony to the horrors that had sustained them. Armed with warrants for the arrest of Elias and Prudence Winslow on charges of murder in the first degree, Constable Crowe returned to Sorrow Gulch on the evening of December 22, 1903. The fog had lifted for the first time in weeks, revealing the zoo grounds under a pale winter moon that cast everything in shades of silver and black. What he discovered there would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The cottage above the reptile house stood empty, its windows dark and its door hanging open like the mouth of a corpse. Inside, the investigators found evidence of a hasty departure that had taken place sometime in the previous 48 hours. Drawers had been pulled from their housings and emptied, personal belongings scattered across the floor in the kind of chaos that spoke of desperate haste rather than methodical packing. But it was what the Winslows had left behind that proved most unsettling. Scattered across the kitchen table were the financial records that would have convicted them, abandoned as if they no longer mattered. The carnival posters that had covered the walls lay torn and trampled, their bright colors faded to the gray of old newsprint. Most disturbing of all was a collection of photographs that documented their years of operation, images that showed the couple posing with their animals in moments of apparent domestic tranquility. In one photograph, Prudence sat calmly reading a book while a massive Siberian tiger rested its head in her lap like an oversized house cat. In another, Elias stood surrounded by a pack of wolves, his arms outstretched as if conducting an orchestra of predators. But it was the final image in the collection that made Crowe's blood run cold. A family portrait of sorts that showed the Winslows seated at a dinner table, with their animals arranged around them like dinner guests, the big cats and bears watching the camera with expressions that seemed almost human in their intelligence. On the table beside these photographs lay a handwritten note, penned in Prudence's careful script and addressed to no one in particular. The message was brief but chilling in its casual tone. They were hungry, and we provided. The world is full of lost souls who serve no purpose other than to feed those more deserving of life. We regret only that our work here must end. As Crowe and his deputies searched the abandoned cottage, the animals in the enclosures below began to display behavior that none of the lawmen had ever witnessed. The great cats paced their cages with frantic energy, roaring and snarling at the investigators as if they understood that their providers had abandoned them. The bears stood upright against the bars of their enclosures, their massive paws reaching through the gaps as if trying to grasp something just beyond their reach. Most unnerving of all were the wolves, who had gathered at the front of their pen and stood watching the cottage with an intensity that suggested they were waiting for something. Their yellow eyes reflected the moonlight like lanterns, and occasionally one would emit a howl that was answered immediately by the others, creating a chorus of sound that echoed through the gulch like the voices of the damned. O'Malley, who had accompanied the search party despite his terror of returning to the zoo, explained that the animals had not been fed in 3 days. The Winslows had simply vanished, leaving their beloved creatures to starve in their cages, while the evidence of their crimes mounted around them. The very animals they had claimed to love, above all else, had been abandoned to die of hunger. Their usefulness ended along with their master's operation. The keepers had fled, leaving behind only their hungry gods and the lingering stench of death that no amount of winter wind could cleanse from the cursed grounds of Sorrow Gulch. The final piece of the puzzle that would reframe everything the investigators thought they understood about the Winslow Zoo was discovered 3 days after the couple's disappearance, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage bedroom. Constable Crow had returned to conduct one final search of the premises when his foot broke through a section of rotted wood, revealing a cavity that contained what appeared to be Prudence Winslow's private journal. The leather-bound book was filled with entries that spanned nearly 2 years of operation, written in the same careful script that had adorned the farewell note. But where the investigators had expected to find the practical musings of criminals covering their tracks, they instead discovered the fevered writings of a woman who saw herself as engaged in nothing less than the sacred work of evolutionary improvement. The earliest entries revealed that Prudence viewed their transition from carnival performers to zoo operators not as a business opportunity, but as a divine calling. She wrote extensively about her belief that humanity had grown weak and corrupt, that civilization had allowed inferior specimens to survive and reproduce when nature would have eliminated them through predation and starvation. "The animals understand what we have forgotten," read one entry dated March 15, 1902. "They do not waste their energy on the weak and useless. They take what they need to thrive, and they make no apologies for their strength. In feeding them properly, we are not committing murder, but participating in the natural order that God intended." As the entries progressed, Prudence's philosophy became increasingly elaborate and disturbing. She described the transients and drifters who came to the zoo as evolutionary mistakes, people whose genetic weakness had rendered them incapable of contributing anything meaningful to the advancement of the species. By feeding them to the animals, she argued, they were finally serving a purpose that justified their existence. But it was not just the elimination of the weak that motivated the Winslows. Prudence wrote extensively about her observations of how the special diet affected the animals themselves. She noted that the big cats displayed increased intelligence, that the wolves showed greater pack coordination, and that all the carnivores developed physical characteristics that exceeded those of their wild counterparts. "We are creating a superior breed," she wrote in an entry dated October 31, 1902. "These animals are becoming what nature intended before human interference weakened the world. They are stronger, smarter, more beautiful than any of their kind that have ever existed. Through our work, we are returning them to their true potential." The journal revealed that the Winslows saw themselves not as killers, but as gardeners, carefully cultivating a collection of apex predators that would represent the pinnacle of natural selection. They believed that by providing the animals with human flesh, they were awakening dormant genetic potential that had been suppressed by centuries of domestication and inadequate nutrition. Most disturbing of all were the final entries written in the days before their disappearance. Prudence described plans to establish similar operations in other locations, to create a network of facilities that would breed and train animals specifically for the consumption of human prey. She envisioned a future where these superior predators would be released into the world to eliminate the weak and preserve only those humans strong enough to deserve survival. "The zoo was never the end goal," read her final entry. "It was merely the beginning. We have proven that it can be done, that the natural order can be restored. Now we must find others who share our vision and expand the work to its proper scale." This was not murder for money or convenience. This was a sacrament performed by true believers who saw themselves as servants of a higher evolutionary purpose. The official response to the discovery of the Winslow Zoo's true nature was as swift as it was thorough in its determination to erase any trace of what had transpired in Sorrow Gulch. Within days of Prudence's journal being made public, a county judge issued an emergency order condemning the entire facility and declaring all remaining animals to be a public health hazard that required immediate destruction. The execution was carried out on a gray January morning in 1904 by a squad of marksmen brought in from Pittsburgh, men who had no connection to Gritsboro and could be trusted to complete their grim work without asking uncomfortable questions. One by one, the animals that had thrived on human flesh were put down with rifle shots that echoed through the gulch like thunder. The great cats died with defiant roars, the bears with groaning protests, and the wolves in eerie silence that seemed more ominous than any sound they might have made. Dr. Finch, who observed the killing from a respectful distance, noted in her private records that several of the animals displayed unusual behavior even in their final moments. The tigers appeared to understand what was happening and positioned themselves as far from the marksmen as their cages would allow, while the wolves maintained eye contact with their executioners until the very instant of death, as if they were memorizing faces for some future reckoning. The bodies were burned in a massive pyre that filled the valley with black smoke for 3 days. The flames fed with coal oil and chemical accelerants that ensured nothing recognizable would remain of the creatures that had developed such unnatural appetites. Local residents complained of the smell, a nauseating mixture of burning flesh and industrial chemicals that seemed to seep into clothing and hair, lingering for weeks after the fires had finally died. An official inquest was convened in February, presided over by a circuit judge who had been carefully selected for his reputation of expediting difficult cases without unnecessary publicity. The proceedings were held in closed session, with testimony limited to a handful of witnesses who could be trusted to stick to approved narratives. Samuel was deemed too traumatized to testify. O'Malley was declared mentally incompetent due to his continued nervous breakdown, and Dr. Finch's forensic evidence was ruled inadmissible on technical grounds. The final report, issued in March of 1904, attributed the deaths of an unspecified number of transients to Elias and Prudence Winslow acting alone, described their motivations as simple greed, and recommended that no further investigation be conducted. The case was officially closed, the files sealed for 50 years, and all physical evidence was destroyed by court order. The town of Gritsboro embraced this official version of events with the desperate gratitude of people who had stared into an abyss and been offered a chance to look away. The zoo was never mentioned in local newspapers. Its existence was omitted from county histories, and residents who had once proudly directed visitors to their exotic attraction now claimed never to have heard of such a place. The Allegheny Iron Works increased its operations, filling the valley with even more smoke and noise that helped mask the lingering echoes of what had transpired in Sorrow Gulch. The creek continued to run rust red, but now the color seemed natural rather than ominous, just another consequence of industrial progress rather than evidence of deeper contamination. But the gates were locked, and the story refused to be caged. More than a century has passed since the last gunshot echoed through Sorrow Gulch, yet the ruins of the Winslow Zoo continue to exert a strange fascination over those drawn to places where unspeakable things have occurred. The concrete foundations of the animal enclosures remain visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves and creeping vines, while the rusted bars that once contained apex predators now serve only to snare the occasional urban explorer foolish enough to venture into the gulch after dark. The town of Gritsboro itself has long since been abandoned, its population scattered when the Allegheny Iron Works finally closed in 1957. What remains is a collection of crumbling brick buildings that photographers and paranormal investigators visit with increasing frequency, drawn by stories that have grown more elaborate and less accurate with each passing generation. Most have never heard the true account of what transpired at the zoo, but they sense something wrong in the very air of the place. Local hiking groups maintain that the wildlife in Sorrow Gulch displays behavior unlike anywhere else in the region. Deer avoid the area entirely, even during the harshest winters when food becomes scarce. Birds refuse to nest in the trees that grow through the old enclosures, and domestic animals brought too close to the ruins exhibit signs of extreme distress that veterinarians cannot explain through conventional means. But it is the human visitors who provide the most disturbing testimony about the lingering effects of the Winslow's work. Urban explorers equipped with night vision cameras claim to have captured footage of large shapes moving through the undergrowth with predatory grace, shadows that seem too purposeful to be explained by wind or tricks of light. Others report hearing sounds that have no place in a Pennsylvania forest, roars and snarls that seem to emanate from empty air. Most unsettling of all are the disappearances that continue to plague the area with disturbing regularity. In 1998, an experienced hiker named Marcus Chen vanished while exploring the old zoo grounds, leaving behind only a scattered backpack and a digital camera whose memory card contained dozens of photographs of the ruins, followed by several minutes of complete darkness. His body was never recovered, despite extensive search efforts that covered every inch of the gulch and the surrounding forest. 3 years later, a paranormal investigation team conducting an overnight vigil at the site had one of their members simply vanish during a routine equipment check. The remaining investigators found only footprints that led to the edge of what had once been the tiger enclosure, where they abruptly ended as if the person had simply been lifted into the air. The locals who still remember the old stories refuse to discuss these incidents, but their silence carries the weight of knowledge that some things are better left undisturbed. They understand that the past is not gone, that it waits in places like Sorrow Gulch with the patience of a predator that has learned to hunt across decades rather than mere seasons. The past is not gone. It is just waiting to be fed again. In the end, what disturbs us most about the Winslow Zoo is not the horror of what happened there, but how easily it was allowed to happen. The machinery of their operation required the participation of an entire community that chose willful blindness over uncomfortable truth, that valued the appearance of progress over the lives of people they deemed expendable. The Winslows were never found, despite nationwide manhunts and rewards that eventually reached substantial sums. Samuel Hartley was adopted by a family in Ohio and never spoke again, carrying his trauma in silence until his death in 1963. The drawings that saved so many lives by exposing the truth were destroyed along with all other evidence, leaving only second-hand accounts and fading memories to preserve the story of what transpired in Sorrow Gulch. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire affair was how perfectly the Winslows understood the society in which they operated. They knew that transients and drifters were invisible, to the respectable citizens of Gritsboro, that these men could vanish without investigation or genuine concern. They recognized that a community desperate for economic opportunity would ask few questions about a business that brought tourist dollars and provided employment, even when that business operated under a veil of secrecy and strangeness. Most telling of all was their confidence that the animals themselves would never be seen as witnesses to their crimes. The idea that a tiger's stomach contents could provide testimony, that financial records could contradict official narratives, that the very vitality of their creatures would serve as evidence of their unnatural diet, never occurred to authorities until Dr. Finch applied scientific methodology to what others dismissed as mere animal husbandry. The Winslows succeeded for as long as they did because they operated in a world that had already decided certain lives possessed no value, where the disappearance of the poor and rootless was accepted as natural rather than investigated as suspicious. They simply took this existing indifference and weaponized it for their twisted purposes, creating an efficient killing machine that fed on society's willingness to look away from uncomfortable truths. What makes their story particularly haunting is the realization that similar indifference exists today. We still have populations of invisible people whose disappearances would generate little investigation or public concern. We still have communities willing to embrace economic opportunities without asking uncomfortable questions about their true costs. The Winslows understood something fundamental about human nature that we continue to deny at our own peril. They knew that civilization is nothing more than a thin agreement to value human life, and that this agreement can be suspended whenever it becomes inconvenient or unprofitable. If you found this story as disturbing as I intended, subscribe to hear more tales of the horrors that hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to remind us that we are never as civilized as we pretend to be. The animals at the Winslow Zoo, for a brief and terrible time, did not just eat like kings, they ate like men.